was the Queen last year, when Boris became Prime Minister, who said that to him in private that she didn't know why anyone would want the job of Prime Minister. And I can understand why she said it. Being a leader, any kind of leader, isn't easy. People often want to be in leadership, but they don't always realize what they're asking for. They like the power, and there's kids who would like to be Prime Minister. That's their childhood dream. Was it Michael Heseltine had at the top of his to-do list for his life to become Prime Minister when he was a teenager? People want the power, but the pressure that comes on and the responsibility to use the power well can be really heavy. And on top of that, you get criticised. Leaders are always being criticised. And so if you want to be criticised and people to put the blame on you, then desire to be a leader. And you can get all the criticism you would ever want. A leader who brings change is criticised by those who don't like change, and the leader who keeps the status quo is criticised by those who want to move on. And a leader can never get away without criticism. You need a skin like a rhinoceros hide to be a Nicola or a Boris. And even a football manager, the amount of abuse that Steven Gerrard or Neil Lennon gets thrown at them. Nobody would want it, and yet they seem to be able to withstand the criticism. Now, this morning we are looking at a letter written by a leader who is getting criticised. And we're looking at the well-known Christian apostle Paul and his letter to a church who was criticising him. This is a church, of course, as you know, he planted, he established it, and he led the people in this church to faith, and then he moved on to do the same in another part of the Roman Empire. And he kept in touch through letters, and people came from the church and told him what was going on in the church, and he gets reports of immorality, and he also hears that he and his message is being criticised. And he's not so happy. He doesn't care personally about the criticism, but he doesn't like the fact that his message and his ministry is being undermined. And the good news of salvation through faith in Christ is not wise enough for the Corinthians. There's a bit of a lack of wisdom in that message, and that's their criticism of the gospel. It's not wise enough. And so you see in early chapters, Paul is defending the wisdom of the gospel. But he's being criticised in different areas. Now, he isn't bothered by the criticism because he knows that he's not a politician who's accountable to the people. A politician is voted in by the people and voted out by the people. A politician is accountable to the people. But Paul, as a Christian leader, is not ultimately accountable to the people. He's accountable to his one single master, and that is Christ. He's a servant of Christ. And Christ has told him to bless the people and, in a sense, serve the people, but not to be a servant to the people. And there's a bit of a difference here. He's not accountable to the people. And Paul knows that he's serving God, and one day God is going to give him a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the way that he served. And so Paul says to the church in Corinth, men ought to regard us as servants of Christ and those entrusted with the mysteries that God has revealed. Now, it's required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. And so Paul is saying to the church, my employer, my boss is God, and he's entrusted me with certain things, the mysteries that God has revealed. That word servant that he says of himself, he's a servant of Christ, is the Greek word huperetes, which is the word for an oarsman. I don't know if you've ever rowed a boat. He's describing himself as an oarsman. And in the Roman Empire, boats had sails, but they also had banks of people manning the oars, putting their back into moving the ship forward. and Paul describes himself basically as an oarsman. As soon as I realised what that word meant to Peretes, I thought of John Knox, an apostle of God sent to Scotland in the 16th century. He was holed up in St Andrews, in the castle in St Andrews, surrounded by the French. They surrendered, and John Knox was captured by the French, and he spent the next 19 months in a French galley, working the oars of a French galley. It's one thing to cross the North Sea on a drive-on, drive-off ferry. It's quite another thing to be chained to an oar, rowing across the North Sea. And John Knox had spent a miserable, absolutely miserable 19 months working there as Peretes. And Paul is saying here, I'm pulling away at my oar for God. God is the boss here, and I'm putting my back into working for him. Don't criticize me, because you're not my boss, is what he's telling the people. But I have been entrusted with something very important to share with you. The secret mysteries of God that have now been revealed. Things that man, with all his science and all his brain, could never have figured out. Paul has been entrusted by the Lord to share with the human race. God has told Paul his secrets. The secret of heaven has been given to this man to steward, not to add anything to, not to take anything away from, to give to the people just as he received it. The secret of a new universe, a new people to be created, recreated by God, to enter into a new universe, which is the promise that we see in Paul's writing for the future. God is in the upcycling business. He'll upcycle us, and eventually he'll upcycle the whole world and the universe. The secret of salvation Paul shares with the people. And down a generation it's been faithfully passed on, and eventually here we are, and we've heard the secrets of God passed on to us. And we are entrusted to pass them on to those around us, the way of salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. What has God entrusted you with? What is it that God has called you to work at, to put your back into? He isn't a slave driver, he's a great boss. He's a great boss, you can't have a better boss, but what's he entrusted you and asking you to do? He gives you a choice, but then he says, will you be faithful to what I'm entrusting you? Speaking to a member of the church who we all know well, and she says, I'm asking right now, Lord, what do you want me to do with my life? And I told her, that's the best question you could ask the Lord. What do you want me to do? Some people doubt that they can hear the Lord speaking to them, and they wonder if the Lord is really guiding them to take this decision or that decision. Well, there's an easy test to see if something that you have in your mind to do, or if a job that's in front of you is from the Lord or not. It's an easy test. Take it to the Lord in prayer and ask him, is this what you want me to do? And keep on asking. And if you have a sense of peace about this thing that you're thinking of doing, and if that peace lingers in your heart, then you know that it's very likely to be God that's leading you to do this thing. Even if it's a challenging and difficult job that you're looking at doing, you will still get a sense of peace if it's from the Lord. But if you have a bit of an unease in your heart and your spirit about this thing, if you don't feel quite at peace about it, well, I think you should doubt whether that really is God telling you to do it, because God will give you peace. I remember I was gearing up for almost a year to work with a certain organisation in Sudan, and I'd said to them yes, that I'd do it, and I had no peace about it at all. And after a week or two, I was very uneasy, and I had to phone them up and say, sorry, this is not God, I've missed God in this one, I'm sorry, I'm not doing it. I had to go a different route, and I believe it was the right decision. Peace is the ultimate umpire, whether what you're doing is from God or not. So often we are influenced and affected by what other people think, and we actually don't step into the things that God has for us because of what other people think and say, and fear of criticism, which the Bible calls a snare. The fear of man is a snare, the Bible says. Fear of what people will say and criticism. And if you want to be free, you can't worry too much about what people say. The fear of man is a snare. The second half of the verse says, but whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe. So overcoming that fear of man. And Paul managed to do it because he was caring more about what his master Jesus thought of him than what those around him were saying about him. He says, I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait till the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of men and women's hearts. At that time, each will receive his praise from God. And so Paul is saying something quite important. He's saying, don't judge other Christians. Don't say this guy's a real good Christian, this girl's a fantastic, or say that they're not a good Christian. Don't assess people as being better or worse on the scale of Christianity. Don't even assess yourself. He says, I don't even assess myself to see how good I am. My conscience is clear, but that doesn't mean that I'm innocent. He says, wait till the day where God will assess how well you did. Our consciences can be faulty. We've all got a conscience, and I've said before, our conscience is the voice of God within us, telling us whether we're doing the right thing or not, but they're faulty, slightly faulty compass. Everything about us has potential to be slightly faulty. We're flawed human beings, including our conscience. And Paul doesn't say that his conscience is perfectly trustworthy. He's depending on the Lord to give him an accurate verdict as to how well he's doing. Only God can do that. Only God can see who we really are when nobody else is looking on. Only God can see that. Only God knows our hearts and the motives behind the things that we do. And God, on the day of judgment, will bring to light what is hidden in darkness, the secret things that we did, the good things we did when nobody was looking, and the bad things we did when no one was looking. And he'll expose what was going on in our hearts, the motives behind the things that we actually did. You know, it's possible to do the right thing for all the wrong reasons. And it's possible to do the wrong thing for all the right reasons. And God will be able to discern on the day of judgment your motives as well as what you did. You can be good to the poor, be generous to the poor, and in such a way that people see and compliment you. And you can actually be generous to the poor from selfish motives so that you will get applause. And Jesus warned against that. You can do something that appears wrong. You can go around the bypass at 90 miles an hour, overtaking everybody. All the other drivers are shaking their head, seeing you driving past. And yet you could be going to the accident or emergency with a severely ill person who needs to get there promptly. And your motive is absolutely right. God will be able to discern your motives as well as what you did on that great day of judgment. He knows us. And he's absolutely fair and just in his judgment. God sees our hearts so clearly. There's a part of your character and personality that you see and everybody around you sees as well. It's kind of obvious to everyone. You're part of your personality and character. There's also a part of your personality and who you are that you see and no one else sees. So you have dreams maybe, you have things in your imagination, you have deep desires that you've not even told your wife, you've not told your best friends. There's things about you that you know nobody else knows. And then there's a part of you that you don't see, but everyone else sees. Nothing worse than watching yourself in a video because you start to see yourself as other people see you. And you think, do I really speak like that? Is that how I act? There's some part of you that you're not really aware of, but people around you are aware of. And then there's a part of you that you don't see, other people don't see, and yet God sees. And the thing is, God will bring it all into his judgment. He'll assess the whole range of things. God knows us inside out. He knows our psychology. He knows the way that our brains are wired. He knows where there's a loose wire or two, where there's a short circuit, where we need to be rewired. And sometimes we need God the electrician to rewire us a little bit. Let me explain what I mean from C.S. Lewis' book, Mere Christianity, who talks about the hurdles that people have to overcome in their minds to do good. And some people have bigger hurdles in their minds to overcome than others. He gives the example of somebody who has a pathological horror of cats. And some people have fears and phobias in their lives which aren't really rational and can restrict them. And C.S. Lewis in his book gives an example of supposing somebody had a pathological fear of cats. Say, for example, while a baby, a feral cat had attacked that woman as a baby, scratched her, and it left an imprint in her psychology, and from that moment on, she had a fear of cats. Not rational, but very real to her. And we've got things in our minds that are very real to us. We've got fears of different things and phobias and so forth that seem maybe a bit strange to other people, but to us, they're really real. Now, for us to do something that overcomes these irrational things in our mind, it takes a greater effort. It takes a greater moral effort than somebody who didn't have these strange quirks in their circuitry. So this woman, supposing she sees an injured cat in the roads, she's always all her life avoided cats, and here is one in the road. She's walking past. Does she go and rescue it before it's run over? Does she leave it? Supposing she chooses with a force of moral effort to get out, pick up the cat, first time in her life she's touched the cat, and carry it back to the pavement. C.S. Lewis says to do such a thing might take more courage than a woman awarded a Victoria Cross on the battlefield, because you're overcoming the mental blocks in your mind to do good. And God knows the hurdles in your mind that you have to overcome to do good. And people with fears and phobias, as an example, have bigger hurdles to leap over. And God knows that. And He will reward you for overcoming these things. God knows the things hidden in darkness and the motives of our heart. Some people have terrible upbringings in life. You know, and I've come across people who've been brought up by parents who were drug addicts and were neglected and had really bad role models in life and didn't know or weren't taught the difference between right and wrong, and were taught that telling lies was fine and even violence was okay. And to see such a person make something of their life, you know, God notices what it took for that person to make the right decisions. And likewise, He notices when people have a tremendous start to life and have great parents who shower love on them and really bring them up well, who send them to Sunday school and send them to Scripture Union camps and introduce them to the things of God and send them to the best schools, best university or whatever, and yet that person coasts along in life, not really trying very hard, not really pursuing the path of Christ that she or he was introduced to as a child. God knows. And He takes into account the things that God gave us, whether they were big or small, that He gave us through maybe our parents or other means. And the way that we are judged on the day of judgment, God will take into account all these things that we got or we didn't have, and our advantages and disadvantages, mentally and in our circumstances in life. So God will judge absolutely fairly. Jesus told His disciples, don't judge by appearance. How often do we judge people by their appearance? But judge rightly, He says. But actually, none of us can really judge rightly. We can't really judge anyone accurately because we don't really know what's been going on in the person's heart. We don't really know their matters, their own inner motives. We shouldn't judge because A, we don't have the information to judge, and B, we're not masters of any other Christian. God alone is their master, and He alone can judge accurately. As you know, my favourite Bible teacher is a man called David Pawson, who died at the age of 90 this year on Ascension Thursday, 9 o'clock Ascension Thursday. David Pawson died. He couldn't have chosen a better time to die. I think the Lord timed it perfectly to take David Pawson. Ascension Thursday. And he wrote a few years ago his autobiography. And the name of the autobiography, David Pawson's autobiography, is Not As Bad As the Truth. If you wrote your autobiography, would you call it Not As Bad As the Truth? Now, that was his autobiography's title. And at the end of the book, he explains why he used these words in the title. He said this, he wrote this: "What will the Lord think of me? He will have the last word on me and on all of us. It is to him that we shall have to give an account for the use of the time and talents he gave us. Each of us will stand before him alone, without the support of family and friends or the accusation of our foes." And then Pawson wrote this: "I have the advantage, perhaps unique, of having more than a hint of the verdict that God will make of me. Some years ago," he wrote, "I was a target of rumours which were totally untrue. And I later tracked them down to a source in Wales and was able to stop them," he says. "But at the time they were painful and damaging." He says, "I turned to the Lord and complained bitterly about the personal pain and damage done to my ministry. I have rarely known the Lord speak to me," he said, "as clearly as he did then." His reply was this: "The worst they can say about you is not as bad as the truth." The worst they can say about you is not as bad as the truth. And Pawson says when he heard the Lord say to him that, he burst out laughing, both at the unexpectedness of it and the relief that his enemies didn't know the worst as much as the Lord did about him. And he said it cured him of his sensitivity to hostile criticism, knowing that the Lord knew the worst about him and yet accepted him. And every Christian here, the Lord knows the worst about you and yet accepts you. And if the Lord accepts you, why should you feel rejection from man? And then God said to Pawson, "The worst they can say about you is not as bad as the truth, but I know the worst, and I still love you and use you." Pawson said, "My laughter was mixed with tears at that point. I realized the incredible grace that God had shown to me." Isn't that great? God knows the worst about us, things that maybe no one else knows, but still loves us and is willing to use us. The goodness of God is truly amazing. Let's say a word of prayer.